The show is notorious for having suffered from a huge quality drop after Lynch left the project. I'd argue that the quality drop was after Leland's death, starting with the funeral episode where just about nothing happens at all. We get a dull middle section, and then the show starts to pick up again with the Wyndham Earle subplot, which, despite being hokey and having its bad moments, was a good way to bring back some of the drama to the show that was missing in the absence of the Laura Palmer mystery. I think almost everybody wanted to see the version of the show that wasn't, but when Lynch returned to the series, he had to work with what the show was, what it had become. The lack of the Laura mystery really destroyed enthusiasm for the show in most people, but Lynch, Frost, and co-writers Harley Peyton and Robert Ingalls brought the Laura mystery back to the forefront and delivered one of the most insane, bizarre hours of any television series ever. If not for the return, episode 29, Beyond Life and Death, would stand out as television's big moment, the moment when TV finally became fully art house. On the most surface level, the episode is brilliant. The fabled Black Lodge has a destination. The Red Room is not just a dream location, but a real place full of otherworldly mysticism and mystery. Bob is real, Leland might not be the killer after all, Laura is back and helps create a very ominous tone of what's going on, with the iconic quote that would reverberate through the legacy of Twin Peaks for 25 years.
I'll see you again in 25 years. Meanwhile,
there's something haunting, existentially terrifying about the Red Room and its portrayal in episode 29. This is a moment where Cooper and the viewer are faced with the reality of cosmic insignificance. What if what we think we know isn't all there is to life? What if dreams are real and reality is dream? Where are we? Who are we? When are we? Beyond Life and Death is an apt title because that's where the show takes us. And it all culminates in the big reveal at the end. Cooper becomes trapped in the Black Lodge, and Bob has now taken over Cooper's body. This lays the foundation for the return 25 years later, and has implications of its own, which will be easier to talk about when we cover the return. Episode 29 was partially course correction for Lynch, who had gotten back control of the show and was disinterested in a lot of the plot threads that were opened up in Season 2 after Leland's death. He made significant changes to the script and additional changes while directing the episode, which overhauled large portions of the original intended ending. A lot of what he changed ended up de-emphasizing Wyndham Earle and Leo, and emphasizing Laura and the events in the Black Lodge. Episode 29 was Lynch's attempt to make the show about what it was always supposed to be about, Laura and the mysteries surrounding her life and death. Ironically, by ending the Laura plot, the show in a sense went beyond life and death, at least as far as she is concerned. So the mysteries of the Black Lodge were partially an opportunity to make Laura's mystery about more than just who killed her. Symbolism has always been a part of Lynch's work, and as I've already mentioned, the symbols are more about the narrative and less allegorical than people think. A symbol need not always be a metaphor. Sometimes a symbol is just an indicator of something, like a stop sign or a traffic light. The symbolism of Lynch's career often does extend into metaphor, but understanding the symbolism, in my opinion, is best by starting from a symbol's role in the narrative and then figuring out what it signifies to the characters. From there, we can also discuss historical and cultural context to understand the symbolism, with a frame of reference that gives it more meaning. People already do this all the time. It's well known that a pale horse is a symbol of death, so I'm sure many fans of Twin Peaks interpret the white horse as being indicative of death. I don't think it's that simple, but I don't think it's necessarily coincidence either. In my opinion, episode 29 is best to understand as the narrative first, before understanding it as symbolism. This is kind of difficult to do because it's really light on plot and really heavy on cryptic information, but I'm going to discuss it anyway. So most of the plot of episode 29 centers on Dale Cooper and his strange adventure in the Black Lodge. In terms of the basic plot of season 2, this is the moment where the Black Lodge is confirmed to be a real place and Wyndham Earle's attempts to access it have been granted, only for Wyndham to find that its cryptic nature is too much for him to manage and he perishes as a result. This shows the power not only of Bob but of the Black Lodge itself. The Red Room has three sort of vaguely alternative histories. In the international pilot, the Red Room is a strange place that Cooper finds himself in 25 years later. In the version that aired on television, the Red Room is a dream that Cooper has, which is based on various details from the search for Laura's killer that he picks up on later. This same technique of a dream being used to determine future details ends up being thrust onto Cooper in the beginning of season 2, with the giant and the clues that the giant gives him. The third alternative history is that which we see in episode 29. The Black Lodge is a real place and is possibly just the Red Room. In terms of the overarching plot of the show, this is the moment where Cooper's strange otherworld begins to collide with reality. This is when Cooper's weird, spiritual attempts at figuring out the mystery of Laura's killer culminates in a tangible result, not just in the investigation, but into that strange other place Cooper keeps going to throughout the show. It's real, physical evidence of the spirits residing in Twin Peaks. We later learn in The Return that, in the world of Twin Peaks, there are all these strange entry points into this other world, including the convenience store, Jack Rabbit's palace, that one weird spot in North Dakota that Gordon and Albert visit, and potentially others. Not only does episode 29 confirm that there is an other world to their own, but also confirms that there is an entry point. But on a narrative level, Cooper is literally physically walking into a dream. This place came to him in a dream, yet it manifests as reality. If we go back to the International Pilot, it feels as though the Red Room was the destination that Cooper was inevitably going to end up in after Laura's killer was found. Here, in episode 29, the same is true. The original script of episode 29 was going to feature the Black Lodge in a very different way, having the setting being like a ghost world of the Great Northern Hotel. I think Lynch deliberately wanted to keep the big reveal in the Red Room in order to tie into Cooper's dream. This strange other dimension, for Cooper, is him having to face the unknowable. Some of the best fiction speculates on the potential realities of unbelievable events. What if aliens were real? What if time travel was real? And what Twin Peaks asks both Cooper and the viewer is, what if dreams were real? This thread of ideas would trace through all of Lynch's original works from Twin Peaks onward, most prominently Mulholland Drive. There's something deeply terrifying about it. The way Lynch works is, rather than having dream logic or a suspended dream state a la fantasy narrative, Lynch grounds his dream ideas in the real world. The Red Room is not simply a dream that Cooper is having. It's a physical place that he can walk inside of. Similar dreams as a physical location in the real world ideas occur in Mulholland Drive to similarly horrific effect. The point of this kind of physicality is to simultaneously cast an eerie shadow over one's own memories and one's own relationship to dreams, but also cast doubt on the nature of one's own reality. If the dream is real, then is reality the dream? Are we real at all, or are we dream? Beyond Life and Death excellently evokes this feeling for both Cooper and the viewer by taking us to a literal place that is exactly like in a dream. This strange other world, like a portal between what is real and what isn't. We'll elaborate on that idea in the next section. Cooper's big strength is in his confidence, even in the face of deep uncertainty. He's a good thinker, but beyond his good reasoning and detective skills, there's a man of intuition, who accepts the world as is and lets information guide him, rather than him guiding information. To suddenly be faced with a strange place like a dream, in which physical and mental logic no longer apply, where intuition seems to guide everything, only a man like Cooper could come out of there alive. However, it ultimately destroys him from within. Cooper turns bad on a narrative level, not just because Bob possessed him, but because he wasn't able to survive a brush-up with the great unknown completely unscathed. Wyndham Earle brought him to the edge of the world, and Cooper jumped off with him. The Red Room, for Cooper, confirms the reality of a great unknown presence that is interacting with his life in the town of Twin Peaks. Going back to what Truman said earlier, there's an evil out in the woods. Cooper has just found it, and he's realized that he's been reaching into this evil to do the right thing, and that he's becoming aware of a tangible force of darkness in the world that he pulls from in order to solve the mystery. The giant, Mike, and possibly the man from another place are all good spirits, trying to guide Cooper to the right path, but alongside them also exists Bob, a spirit that also resides in the Red Room and is strictly evil. The potential for evil was already present in Cooper, and Bob brings it out of him by making him bargain for the life of another. I think understanding the Red Room in full requires engaging more intently with how it's used in Fire Walk With Me, which we'll get to in the next video. But for now, I just want to say that episode 29 is a brilliant work of surrealist horror, as it captures this feeling that the vast world we're a part of is only a small fraction of the reality we live in, and so much beyond what we can see is beyond what we can even comprehend. Cooper has a run-in with the universe in full. Lynch has explored this idea in the never-completed Ronnie Rocket project. Ronnie Rocket's ending in particular, and the story generally, helps provide a lot of context for the ideas in Twin Peaks. I want to discuss the ending to Ronnie Rocket based on one of the versions of the screenplay so that I can talk a bit more about the Red Room. This means spoilers for a movie that never got made, but you can find the Ronnie Rocket screenplay online if you want to read it without hearing spoilers. Ronnie Rocket is a story about a little man who is nearly killed and has his body fixed by turning him into a cyborg that needs to plug in the outlets to recharge. Doing so causes Ronnie to shoot bright sparks out of his mouth and produce a wonderful noise. This wonderful noise is so beloved by people that he becomes a rock and roll singer. The plot is dense and very surreal, and I'm doing it a disservice by summarizing it. The point is the ending. The movie ends with some evil force being defeated during, I believe, one of Ronnie's performances. Then the electricity in the city gets reversed. I'm going to read the rest verbatim. Apologies for my narration being a bit weak. The city lights up with a golden morning light from a gigantic new sun. Ronnie glows white hot on the stage and floats up. The crowd chants, "Ronnie Rocket." Some yell, "He's floating. He's..." The band and all around him disappears in golden white light. Ronnie floats up golden in space. The detective, Terry, Bob, Dan, Deborah, Diana, Riley, all float and merge inside of Ronnie. The whole city is golden inside of Ronnie. Ronnie sings his love song. Ronnie is a golden egg. The egg appears in a room now. The room has an ocean for a floor. In the room, many tiny golden eggs float. A small girl sits on her father's lap. We see the strangely beautiful girl, but the father's back is to us. Father, when will all the new universes be born? Soon, and when they are, I'm going to get you a great big chocolate to celebrate. Oh, Father, really? She hugs him, and as they get up to leave, we leave with one little golden egg across the room to a blue lady with 4 arms who is doing a strange dance on a lily pad. One arm stops dancing and reaches out. A finger touches the one little golden egg. The woman smiles and laughs. Ronnie Rocket. The end. Now, why is this relevant? Well, something we see happen in the return is we see people become converted to small golden balls. I see this as a reference to Ronnie Rocket with the golden eggs. The golden eggs are universes within people. That is to say, in terms of Lynch's philosophy, each person has a universe within them that they both create and live inside. As I've said before, it's both a postmodern concept and a spiritual concept. Our perception creates our ability to comprehend our universe, which in a sense creates the universe for us as though it's a dream. We perceive reality the same way we perceive dreams, and both manifest for us through our perception, hence reality itself is like a dream. Ronnie Rocket explores the idea of entities beyond the universe contained within its narrative. So too does Eraserhead before it, and Twin Peaks, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, and Inland Empire after it. Twin Peaks in particular shows us this realm beyond the universe contained within its narrative, and this manifests visually as the Red Room. It's not that Cooper created the world of Twin Peaks and the Red Room exists outside of it, but everyone did. Laura created the universe of Twin Peaks, as did Cooper, as did Leland, or Ben, or Catherine Martell, or Hank, or the Log Lady, or Truman, or Hawk. Twin Peaks is a collective dream state that, by existing in a state of limited perception as human beings, the people of Twin Peaks simultaneously live inside of and create through their perception. It's sort of an existentialist philosophy, too. It's not just your perception that creates the world, but it's your actions. It's who you are as a person. You influence your surroundings, your community, your life. The collective group of societies, towns, cities, civilizations, nations, and so on, we all collectively contribute in some small way to the world we live in. Twin Peaks, the town the characters live in, becomes what it is because of the decisions that people make. Drug trafficking exists in the town because people choose to do it. Laura's death is a disruption of the reality they live in because it changes how everyone in the town perceives it. The collective dream of Twin Peaks is both meta and it's sociological, because the characters of Twin Peaks all perform some small role in creating the world they belong to. Your actions affect your world. This is why they are all like the dreamer who dreams and then lives inside the dream. Cooper has discovered something that exists outside of the confines of the world that he's helped create, a world outside of the world. Episode 29 is about a run-in with the unknowable, and the unknowable is an abstract concept, but not as abstract as one might think. In the original Twin Peaks show, Laura Palmer plays a huge role in the narrative, but very little role in the direct plot. She's been long dead by the time Cooper enters the Black Lodge in episode 29, and since halfway into season 2, she's barely even been relevant anymore. But in addition to bringing her mystery back into the series in the season 2 finale, Lynch also specifically sought to bring back the imagery of the Red Room, and I want to discuss what this means in relation to Laura Palmer and Fire Walk with Me. The Red Room, in its original version in the unaired international pilot, was a mysterious ending without an apparent textual meaning. In the series that aired, the Red Room was a dream Cooper had that gave Cooper clues as to who killed Laura Palmer, specifically by giving him clues as to her final days leading up to the night of her murder. Two obvious examples are the red curtains, which were apparently in Jacques' cabin and that Laura posed in front of in order to model for Flesh World, and the fact that Laura speaks of her arms bending back, a reference to her being tied up by the killer prior to her murder. Now, my attitude has been, and still kind of is, that Lynch's weird mystical ideas in Twin Peaks tended to come first prior to any explanation. He visualizes the Red Room, puts it in the series, and then the writers work to make it make sense in the canon of the show. Despite this, I think that Lynch and the writers of Twin Peaks were both working towards discovering meanings within the mysterious elements, rather than either mapping it all out preemptively or just throwing random shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. I think that Beyond Life and Death is partially a mystery going forward, but is also partially meant to wrap up the events of Twin Peaks in the face of cancellation by taking a lot of the mystery and giving it some kind of meaning. So the Red Room, as a dream, is Cooper getting a vision into Laura's past trauma via cryptic identifiers of her last days, but it's not solely that. As we learn, Laura's cousin comes to town and she looks almost exactly like Laura Palmer, just like Laura said in Cooper's dream. The Red Room is also an indicator of the future, so the saying goes in the later installments of the franchise, is it future or is it past? Maddie, of course, would later also be brutally murdered by Leland, which is the key that allows Cooper to actually eventually find Leland and capture him. So one could assume that the Laura we see in Cooper's dream is Maddie, or that it's Laura referencing the future arrival of Maddie. We look at the international pilot and think about it in terms of canon, then fast forward 25 years from the day Cooper enters the town of Twin Peaks. Maddie would be dead by this point, Laura would be dead, so it could hypothetically be either girl that Cooper is seeing. It's not super important to what I want to discuss, but it's interesting to ponder. The Red Room as Cooper's dream is a manifestation of Laura's trauma in Cooper's mind. Her traumatic final days, and later Maddie's traumatic final day, are represented in Cooper's dream. Then, when Cooper finds the Black Lodge, it appears that Laura Palmer's traumatic final days, as seen through the lens of Cooper's vision, have manifested into a real place with Cooper isn't just brushing up against the existential horror of the great unknown, but also the existential horror of Laura Palmer. In Fire Walk With Me, we see spiritual beings of various kinds that seem to be growing in power, influence, and prominence in the narrative. We learn of Garmonbozia, which we eventually learn in the canon of Twin Peaks is the pain and sorrow of people that the spirits feast off of in order to gain more power. So Laura's pain and sorrow is allowing them to grow more powerful, and her taking the ring that we see in Fire Walk With Me is an act of cutting them off. In Fire Walk With Me, the spiritual rot of it all almost feels like a spiritual cancer, as though these strange spirits are manifesting through the gradual growth of suffering within Laura. As we learn in The Return, Bob is born of the atomic bomb, a man-made form of serious existential horror. The connection is being made throughout the series of spirits as manifestation of man-made suffering. This suffering is environmental, it's economic, it's political, and it's interpersonal. It's the darkness that Harry initially speaks of in episode 3. If we ignore the chronology of the series and focus on the Red Room in a more abstract sense, it feels to me like Laura's ongoing suffering manifested the Red Room, just like the atom bomb manifested Bob in the place above the convenience store. All these things are spiritually connected through human trauma and suffering as induced by other humans. So when Cooper walks into the Black Lodge, he's not just walking into his dream, he's walking into his dream about Laura. He's walking into the echoes of her traumatic final days. Laura's past, her future, her essence manifests in Beyond Life and Death. We see the good Laura, who tells Cooper she'll see him in 25 years, which at that point in the show's history likely referred to Cooper's dream, which in the international pilot was a strange future that occurred 25 years after Cooper solved the case. We see Maddie, who vanishes, and then we see Laura's doppelganger. In terms of the doppelgangers as they apply to this particular episode, I think the doppelgangers are a reference to the split natures of good and evil within people. When faced with the existential angst of our lives and the absurdity of existence and mortality contained within it, we have a choice towards despair and courage. Both sides of people exist within all of us. Those who despair, who break down and let the great angst of existence crush them, they have the capacity to become corrupted, and this corruption is what manifests the doppelgangers, the sort of spiritual cancer that feeds from those who've lost hope. It's the bad version of them. Now, while Cooper is learning more and more about Laura through this episode, he's also being faced with a great crisis of his own. Wyndham Earle, the man who killed his own wife over enraged jealousy about Cooper's taking a liking to her, has access to Black Lodge. What this means for the storyline is unclear, but what it means for Cooper is that Cooper is being faced with his past demons, his own trauma. Just as the Red Room is a manifestation of Laura's trauma, the Red Room manifests within it Cooper's trauma. He sees Caroline, the woman who he loved and who died for it. Cooper seems in this episode to blame himself on some level for it and fears that Annie, who has been taken by Wyndham Earle, is going to befall the same fate. Cooper's big anxiety, as explored in Beyond Life and Death, is that he can't save innocent women from abusive men, and he can't ever let his guard down and feel a close, romantic connection for a woman without it being taken away from him. He feels guilty about his desire to love and be loved, and he feels fear about the effect he and other men can have on women. This is why he sees Caroline's dead body and sees Annie in Caroline's dress, because Cooper is terrified of what's going to happen to Annie is the same thing that happened to Caroline. Wyndham Earle is, in many ways, the mirror character for Dale, Oppositional forces are a big feature of Lynch's work, and we see this most obviously with the doppelgangers themselves, but we also see it with characters that exist to contrast some aspect of a character or even the character on the whole. With Dale and Albert as contrasts between attitudes about small-town America, or Donna and Laura as contrasts about innocence and girlhood, or Bobby and James as contrasts in their romantic relations to Laura. Wyndham Earle is Dale's alternate self who went insane and gave into the darkness of the world. That darkness includes the spiritual darkness and the interpersonal and political darkness of patriarchal power. Wyndham Earle is the Dale who is jealous, violent, entitled to women, and exploitative. He is the Frank Booth to Dale's Jeffrey, especially as far as season. So Dale's great trauma is in having to confront this other possibility within Dale, that he too could become a vindictive, cold, hateful, and on some level misogynistic man concerned only with his own needs. Beyond Life and Death is Dale facing his own traumas through the manifestation of the trauma of Laura. If Cooper's dream was Dale seeing Laura through himself, Beyond Life and Death is in a way Dale seeing himself through Laura. Laura and Dale face similar existential crises, Laura in Fire Walk With Me and Dale in Beyond Life and Death. Dale's facing the possibility that love is not enough, that goodness can be corrupted, that reality can be frail and absurd, that women can suffer without repercussions for those who instigate the suffering, that he could really deep down be just like Wyndham. Laura's crises will be covered more when I discuss Fire Walk With Me, but the important part is that Dale is facing his own demons, and they ultimately break him. His doppelganger prevails, he becomes trapped in the Black Lodge, and goodness leaves the world of Twin Peaks once more, just as it did when Laura died. Laura and Dale are also a bit of a contrast, specifically in gender. This goes back to Blue Velvet, where Jeffrey, played by Kyle MacLachlan, has to struggle with desiring women while also being well aware of his own capacity to benefit from patriarchal exploitation of women. In that film, Jeffrey ultimately defies the exploitation of Dorothy through his decision to help her break free from the clutches of Frank Booth and end her exploitation so that she can live peacefully with her son. I said in a previous part of this video that Laura is the Dorothy who never got away. What that means is that Laura had already encountered great exploitation at the hands of men and it had gotten so extreme that it killed her. Laura is representative of the horrors of misogyny in a patriarchal society. Laura's trauma is in patriarchy's effect on her, and Dale had to have seen this in her story. Dale's basic trials throughout the show are pretty simple, but grow immensely more complicated in Season 2. A lot of it revolves around Audrey Horne. First, Dale sees that Audrey is desperate and wants some kind of intimacy with him. This isn't exactly a hard call to make, but Dale decides not to have sex with her or do anything of the sort. Dale's a decent guy, and that scene works in the context of showing how these two characters think. Dale is not a man who desires patriarchal power, but the problem with patriarchal societies is that this power is still thrust onto them all the time. Dale, as a man of considerable social respect and privilege, could just as easily treat Audrey the way that Leland treats Laura or the way that Ben treats the girls at One-Eyed Jack's. Dale could easily get away with it. But as Season 2 happens and Audrey becomes kidnapped, suddenly Dale's respect and admiration of Audrey has its dynamic changed. This moment in the series is at least a little similar to when Jeffrey finds Dorothy naked on his front lawn. Jeffrey is seeing Dorothy through the lens of patriarchal dominance, but is horrified by it. Similarly, Dale is being forced to see what happens to girls like Audrey when a patriarchal world does exploit her. In this case, she's kidnapped and held for money and at serious risk of being killed. She was also almost molested by her own father. Audrey would, or at least should have been deeply traumatized by this whole subplot. Dale's big internal struggles surround women and patriarchal power. As Laura's struggles were centered on how patriarchy affected her, Dale's struggles are centered on having to see how patriarchy affects women and then ponder the moral choices he has to make to either accept the logic of patriarchy or defy it, just as Jeffrey before him. Dale's backstory with Caroline is an extension of this, just as his fascination with Laura is an extension of this. Dale wants a better world for everyone, but his existential crisis is in his empathy for others and desire to fight their exploitation. He can't save Laura, he can't save Caroline, and he might not even be able to save Annie. The ending of Beyond Life and Death, while Dale is possessed by Bob and mockingly repeating "How is Annie?" and laughing, this is a Cooper who has been broken and driven mad by a cruel, patriarchal world. This is a Dale who has gone from wanting to save Annie's life by any measure to actively mocking the idea that it matters if she survives or not. This is what happens when good men. As the Log Lady will say in Fire Walk With Me, there's a type of fire that is very hard to put out, and when it spreads, all goodness is in jeopardy. This point that the Log Lady says is a thread that ties all of the themes throughout the franchise together, and it spiritually connects Laura to Donna into the very next scene, to Bobby and James, to Maddie and Sarah, and eventually, long after, to Dale Cooper. Goodness is in jeopardy when man-made exploitation, malice, and destruction permeates the human experience. Laura knows that it's not just her, she's part of a bigger picture, but there's a universe inside of her that comes alive in the form of the Twin Peaks universe. Just as her trauma manifests a spiritual decay in the world around her, so too does Cooper's. Season 2 wasn't necessarily meant to be the end, but due to cancellation, I think Lynch changed a lot of episode 29 to reflect the possibility that this may be the end for Twin Peaks. The universe of Twin Peaks was given life by its own production, and when cancellation happens, so too does the universe of Twin Peaks end. We can only get a brief glimpse of this world by watching this show, and so Cooper, Laura, Donna, James, all of these characters' existence as hypothetical human beings is reliant on there being a show for them to inhabit. The pilot gave them all life, and Beyond Life and Death took that away. Dale's story effectively ends here, even though it continues on into Fire Walk With Me and The Return. When Dale enters the town of Twin Peaks, a great source of goodness enters through him. In Beyond Life and Death, that same goodness exits because if this is where the show ends, there will be no more Dale Cooper to give us as viewers or the world of the show any more hope or goodness. So the ending of Twin Peaks Season 2 is reflective of the state of the show itself. Just as Maddie's light left the world and led to a great sadness, and Laura's before it as seen in the pilot, so too does Cooper leave the world all the more bleak. And with that, we can finally transition to the final, perhaps weirdest side of Twin Peaks as a show. Let's finally discuss the meta themes of Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks has an interesting relationship with the fourth wall. Nobody in the show ever fully becomes aware of their status as characters in a TV show, and yet the show does, throughout the course of its run, allude to meta-themes that present themselves through the more surreal and spiritual moments in the show. Think about it this way. The show's events are, to a degree of absoluteness, informed by the show's production. After all, there is no show without the production of said show. However, as a bit of a self-aware critique of television, the production of the show also informs its contents in a more self-aware manner. Rather than simply being a show that was made to be surreal, Twin Peaks was made to be surreal as a reference to its own making. Eraserhead, for reference, begins with a shot of Henry in the middle of space, one of the more surreal and spiritual moments in the film, and one of the most overtly surreal openings to any of Lynch's works. Importantly, Henry is looking at us, the audience. This awareness of the audience might not be the intent of the scene, but he is still, literally speaking, looking at the fourth wall. In film and TV, actors are typically informed or already know not to look directly at the camera. After all, its role is to capture a reality that is not real and to seemingly not exist. If one looks at the camera, it might make the audience aware of the presence of a camera in a set. When the film or TV show ceases to be a world contained within itself and starts to be a literal set upon which a cast, crew, and equipment is being used to construct this world, then we lose suspension of disbelief. Lynch, of course, doesn't seem to care much about suspension of disbelief and is sometimes notorious for the stiffness of his actors in many scenes, as well as surreal elements that absolutely break any attempts at realism. So when, for example, in Mulholland Drive, we pull back from a scene of singers recording in a recording booth to reveal that it's actually an audition for a film with filmmaking equipment, a director sitting in a chair, and so on, the falseness of the recording booth setting becomes self-evident. Twin Peaks never pulls back to reveal that it's simply a show being filmed, and never, until The Return, actually features a character looking directly at the camera as if to imply their awareness of the show's non-reality. Instead, the show inverts the relationship with a bit of a trickle-down effect. The elements of the construction of the show, rather than destroying the world that it's attempting to construct, instead become part of the world through surrealist influences on the show. In fact, you could argue that the show specifically employs the use of Deus Ex Machina and other unrealistic interventions from the creators to stir up the plot and intrigue of the show via supernatural occurrences that happen within the show. Consider this. Major Briggs disappears at the end of the episode after the episode in which Laura Palmer's killer is found and dies. The show needs a new mystery, so a magical event happens suddenly at the end of the next episode to create a new mystery. When Laura Palmer's killer is revealed, it's suddenly and abruptly revealed through a supernatural vision in which the giant makes Dale Cooper vaguely aware of the murder of Maggie Ferguson by Laura's killer. We then learn through this vision that Leland Palmer is Laura's killer. When the show needs to resolve the mystery, it is done suddenly and through a supernatural occurrence. This is why I've dubbed it meta-spirituality, because the spiritual elements of the show inform the plot and meaning of the show through their referencing the way in which the production of the show changed with time. An example is the Red Room. The Red Room and the revelation of Bob both happen in the third episode, but upon recently getting a hold of the copy of the international pilot with an alternate ending, I found that the Red Room and the revelation of Bob both happened before in the pilot. See, the show wasn't expected necessarily to take off as a series, so when the pilot was shot, they also shot an additional ending in which Laura's killer would be revealed and killed that they could package as a TV movie for international release. The show did eventually become a series, but the international pilot was released on VHS with the additional ending. You could see the show as having lived several different lives, or having several different canons. In the version where the show never took off, Dale Cooper finds Bob and he is killed by Mike, with the Laura Palmer case being settled within days of Cooper's arrival. Cooper then sees himself 25 years later in the Red Room. We'll discuss the presence of the Red Room shortly. If the show hadn't been picked up as a pilot, then Lynch had an ending in place to give it a sense of finality. This international pilot is a potential reality of Twin Peaks, where if it hadn't been picked up, it's all we would have had. It would have been Twin Peaks in its totality. In the version where the show did take off, we got the show we got. There are also alternate histories in which Twin Peaks got a Season 3 shortly after Season 2, or in which we got a second film after Fire Walk With Me, or in which the show never made it past Season 1. The version we eventually got was 2 seasons, a movie, and a reboot in the return. Within these separate lifetimes or canons, there is some intermingling. The international pilot is the most notable example, with the ending of the international pilot being appropriated by the show as a dream sequence Cooper has, which allows him to find out about Bob and the Red Room. If we interpret this in a very literal sense, Cooper is seeing the alternate reality in which he had found Bob, and this allows him to know the name of Bob, the demon who eventually is revealed to be possessing Leland Palmer. The case in the show we got is informed by an alternate canon that never actually transpired in the show itself, but in a way it did, because even despite it being an alternate version of the show, it still affected the current version. This is what I mean by meta-spiritual. The show's spirituality is self-referential, alluding to the show's own creation and its various twists and turns throughout its production. It's also worth noting that a large amount of the spiritual stuff, especially the stuff that stuck such as the Red Room, are all things that were revealed in episodes directed by Lynch. Lynch seemed to have the largest hand in the spiritual elements of the original show, and I think this is part of why the spiritual elements take on a meta quality. Let me go ahead and run through a few of the moments where the show seems to allude to its own production history through spiritual events. First, there's the international pilot, where the ending is a deus ex machina that was added in the event that the pilot didn't get picked up as a series. The ending in the Red Room seems to imply that in the version of the show, the whole thing was just a dream, and I tend to interpret the show as being a dream that was conceptualized by Lynch, with the Red Room being a middle dimension between the dream world of Twin Peaks and the real world of our own world, as the return eventually makes clear. So I see this ending as Cooper waking up from the dream world of Twin Peaks as the dream of both the world and of the show's production ends with the capturing of Laura's killer. Second, there's the Red Room dream that Cooper later has, which I interpret as a reference to the alternate ending of the pilot, in which Cooper sort of sees an alternate dream version of his life, in which Bob gets revealed, which helps him to solve the mystery through major clues. Third, there's the giant who reveals major clues to Cooper, aiding him in solving the case through some kind of divine revelation, which I always see as being revealed by Lynch to Cooper in order to give Season 2 some momentum. Fourth, there's the reveal of Laura's killer, which is done via another divine revelation from the giant, who comes to Cooper to tell him it's happening again. This scene is framed very tragically, and while it's a great scene in its own right, the scene was forced by executives. This forcing of the killer's reveal, I think, is being referenced by the fact that it is suddenly revealed via, again, a deus ex machina in the form of a giant appearing to Cooper. The fact that people seem so sad, particularly Donna, is, in my opinion, partially meta. It's lamenting how dark and miserable the show has gotten, and also lamenting the fact that the producers forced Lynch to reveal the killer. It's almost as if Donna is crying, without realizing it, over the inevitability of Maddie's death, which itself was the result of studio demands. This scene in particular, I think, references the production and showcases the trickle-down effect of production troubles being the root cause of Twin Peaks' constant shifts in narrative via unexplained supernatural occurrences. The show then sort of derails after Lynch left the show, with this episode being the last one he had involvement in for a while. The show also incidentally gets a lot more supernatural, as I think the other people working on the show were trying to drum up intrigue via strange things. Apart from maybe the disappearance of Major Briggs, which responds to the absence of a mystery through creating one with another sudden, unexplained supernatural event, these ones I think are easier to ignore as they weren't influenced by Lynch's work on the show, which is what I'm prioritizing for the sake of this video. Lynch did come back for the finale of Season 2, and Season 2's dark ending, including the possession of Dale Cooper by Bob, I think simultaneously creates a reason for there to be a Season 3, and also references how far out of touch the show had gotten with itself via the studio meddling in its creation. It was essentially a big fuck you to the executives responsible for Twin Peaks' downfall. It also, importantly, brought Laura back to the show and created ambiguity about the original decision to make Leland the killer, so that the themes about Laura could become emphasized. Lynch used surrealism to effectively try to retcon decisions he must not have liked, including the reveal of Laura's killer, but also the presence of Annie Blackburn, Wyndham Earle, Ben Horne turning good, and Nadine thinking she's in high school. Every potential reality of a show as it could be has some effect, big or small, on the show as it is. This is why Twin Peaks has a sort of meta approach to its spiritual and surreal elements, because the show is exploring the potential realities and their value. Lynch is very preoccupied with the nature of reality and of dreaming in all of his works, and a famous quote that he used when describing the meaning of Inland Empire, pulled from a philosopher named Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, reads as follows. "We are like the spider. We weave our life and then move along in it. We are like the dreamer who dreams and then lives in the dream. This is true for the entire universe." This quote is spiritual in nature, but can be read through the lens of several different philosophies, including existentialist and postmodern philosophy, both of which Lynch either pulls from deliberately or coincides with. The quote is shortened in Lynch's own work as the phrase, "We live inside a dream." This is about dreams, and it's also about fiction, but importantly, it's about reality. What Lynch is saying, and what the philosopher is saying, ties into the basics of postmodern theory that I referenced in the introduction video for this series. Limited perception. We are all taking part in a strange, abstract realm we call reality. This reality is being filtered permanently through a fixed consciousness, our individual perception. My perception is different from yours, and because of this, we are sharing this collective consciousness in different ways. We're both on the planet Earth together at the time you're watching this video, but we're experiencing it permanently from our own bodies, me from mine, you from yours. Postmodern theory puts forth that because we can never experience information in its fullest, most objective state, and always experience it through the filter of our own consciousness, including its own faults and flaws and limits, we are only experiencing a small percentage of reality at any given time. This leaves us susceptible to error and further to manipulation. Postmodern theory promotes skepticism of universal truths by acknowledging the faults in human perception that we are all capable of. Theories of performativity and other postmodern theories put forth that, rather than perceiving certain things, we, in a way, constitute them. Judith Butler argues, for example, that our acting out of gendered roles in society constitutes our gender, rather than the fact of our anatomy. And solipsism as a philosophy is all about acknowledging that, since we are only able to perceive from our own perspective, we effectively can't prove that anything exists except ourselves. In movies like The Matrix, postmodern theories are explored through science fiction. How do we know what we believe to be real is real? If perception is faulty, then we could all be plugged into a machine and not know it. Anything's possible. Postmodern theory doesn't suggest such absurd extremes, but instead suggests that, since any potential reality can be obfuscated by limited perception, we have to carefully consider all information we're presented with, as well as the lenses through which we view this information. So what does the quote that Lynch likes to pull from mean? It means that from birth we are placed in a form of consciousness that allows us eyes into the reality before us. As such, we basically create what we know to be reality through our perceiving it, as though we are dreaming real life. Perception is created by our brain just like a dream is, and then we live in the reality that we perceive, just like a dreamer creates the dream to then live inside of it. Lynch seems fascinated with this idea and likens fiction itself to dreams, hence his surrealist vision for most of his original works. It's not that his films portray one dream narrative and one actual real story. It's all fiction. None of it is real. Instead, all fiction is a dream, a collective dream that we participate in by viewing it, hence creating our perception of it, creating the dream, and then living inside it by becoming immersed in its world. There is not a dream versus real dichotomy in Lynch's work. Instead, it's all dream and it's all real. It's our dream as we watch it, and Lynch's dream as he makes it. It's this sort of universalist solipsism that Lynch seems to be promoting in his work by suggesting that it's not the presence or absence of reality that matters, but the nuggets of truth we can pull from any potential reality. Twin Peaks uses spiritual elements to play around with the potential realities of the show in-universe, just as the creators of the show play around with the potential realities of the show outside of the universe of the show. The reason why the show seems to have a trail of breadcrumbs, but really doesn't, is because the audience seems primarily concerned with logic, while Lynch is primarily concerned with meaning and aesthetic. And there's an important difference. A scene doesn't have to have a clear conclusion in order to mean something. The giant's presence can be meaningful even if it doesn't lead to a clear resolution. People got used to viewing TV as if A and B, therefore C. They expect that since there is a profound sense of mystery, there must be a simple answer. Lynch isn't looking for answers to a story, but explorations of the world and events of a story in order to look for answers to moral and political quandaries. The meta-spiritual elements of Twin Peaks continue to inform the meaning of the show well past its original run, In the Fire Walk with Me and The Return, and the notion of potential realities becomes even more prevalent in those later additions to the series. Here, in the original show, it's definitely present, but it's not fully given its proper context until the end of The Return, when it becomes clear just how much the spiritual aspects of the show are toying with the meta. Cooper is, throughout the show, one of the more aware characters of the potential realities that exist all around him, and he's also the one seemingly most aware of the supernatural elements of the world he belongs to. Arguably, the Log Lady is slightly more aware of things than Cooper, but her role is far less involved, and the show is more about how these various potential realities become revealed to Cooper. Cooper is being made aware of the unreality of his own world as audience surrogate to give us the opportunity to reflect on both his world and our own world. Now let's address the Red Room. What is the Red Room? Well, to my understanding, it's like a sort of waiting room between two different states. The most obvious answer is a waiting room between this life and the afterlife, or between life and death. Cooper waiting in the Red Room for 25 years prior to the return is like being in a comatose state, as though one were between being alive and being dead. What do people do in the Red Room? They mostly just sit and wait for something to happen. But what causes things to happen? I already think of the show as being a bit meta-spiritual. The spirituality of the show is contrived deliberately by the creators in order to create the story that we see. So why does Cooper finally leave the Red Room 25 years later? Because the story needs him to be back. He can now leave the waiting room. Now let's bring this fully into the meta. Let's think about where red curtains are most prominently seen and why one would wait in a room adorned with red curtains. Red curtains are associated with show business, most prominently film and theater. A theatrical performance uses red curtains to obscure the front stage from the audience, and also to obscure the backstage from the audience. An audience member uses the fourth wall as a window into a theatrical production's world, and the red curtains ascend to allow us to see it, and descend to prevent us from seeing it, so that they can make changes while we're not looking. While this is all happening in the front stage, and the backstage, also sometimes obscured by red curtains, actors wait for their part in the story to come up, and the people involved with the production often hurry to switch outfits for actors and whatnot. Basically, the red curtains obscure our ability to see what is going on during a production, so that those involved in the production can do what they have to for the sake of the production itself. The red curtains are mostly there for our sake as an audience, so we don't need to suspend our disbelief. I like to think of the Red Room as being the backstage of the show of Twin Peaks. If you think about it this way, when Cooper leaves the Red Room in The Return, he returns to the world of the show. If the show were a play, then the world of Twin Peaks would be the front stage and his return would be to the story, just as a character in a play might make a triumphant return after being thought dead. They would return from the backstage to being visible. The screen itself is the fourth wall of TV and film, and they don't require a curtain to obscure the front stage because they can manipulate what we're seeing at all times. But the Red Room to me reads as a backstage for the show, where people wait to be reintroduced into the narrative of the show or the world of the show. The story doesn't really happen while characters are in the Red Room, it more just kind of stops. A lot of what happens in the Red Room is people waiting around while the story happens in their absence, just like waiting in the backstage for their time to be called back into the story. So when Twin Peaks is showing us the Red Room, they're showing us the backstage of the narrative. They're implying the unreality of the narrative both by showing us that dreams can be real and thus reality could be a dream, and also by showing us that behind the story there is some unknown place that the characters can find themselves in. Cooper discovering the Red Room is basically Cooper discovering the fourth wall, or discovering what lies behind the world of Twin Peaks itself. Our world. So the Red Room is sort of a portal between our world and the world of the show, just like the fourth wall is a window into a constructed world, and the backstage is the goings-on behind the constructed world to actually do the constructing of said world. We are being exposed to the reality that what we are seeing is little more than a production. That even though we can't literally see curtains obscuring the show's production, there is a metaphorical curtain that obscures what lies behind the construction of the show of Twin Peaks. Cooper entering the Red Room in Beyond Life and Death is Cooper transcending the narrative of Twin Peaks and showing him and us the nearly unfathomable notion that he is not real. Someone manufactured him. He is fiction, and he and we are being made aware of this fact. Now, if you want to go further with the backstage metaphor, think about who ends up in the Red Room, why, and what that entails. Let's focus again on Dale Cooper. In the international pilot, he defeats Bob, and the story ends right there. The story ends, of course, because the creators expected that to be the last of the show and wanted to give it a sense of finality just in case. So we zoom ahead to 25 years, and Cooper finds himself in the Red Room. His role in Twin Peaks is served, and so he can pass on into a sort of afterlife, or in a meta sense, he can retreat to the backstage because the narrative is over. In Beyond Life and Death, Cooper discovers the Red Room and then ends up trapped inside it as an evil Dale leaves in his place. In this ending, good Cooper's role in the narrative is now either done or on hold, so he can again retreat to the backstage and wait for his In Fire Walk With Me, Cooper exists in the narrative via flashbacks and via the supposed current timeline in the Red Room. Cooper is being shown Laura's life immediately prior to her death, but this story ends again with him in the Red Room, but this time consoling Laura. While in the Red Room, he's not actually in the narrative of the film, so when he consoles Laura at the end of the film, this ending is basically just like the international pilot ending, where his role in the narrative is done, so he ends right back where he always ends up. In The Return, and sorry for any spoilers, he starts in the Red Room, leaves the Red Room, finds himself in a state of extreme impotence, serves very little function for the narrative, and then the story starts over at the end with him in the Red Room again. And then a new story starts, and then it ends abruptly, and we see one final shot. And what is it? Again, Dale Cooper in the Red Room. All major threads of each story of Twin Peaks end up in the Red Room, meaning every story ends with Dale, and Laura as well, retreating to this suspended state where they can have no further story beyond the narrative of Twin Peaks itself. I mean, think about it. If Cooper ends up in the Red Room at the end of every possible story of Twin Peaks, then he ends up in a suspended state where he won't have any further story. He will simply wait in the Red Room forever until another Twin Peaks story happens. That's the only way he will be let out, because Twin Peaks is breaking the fourth wall with the Red Room and acknowledging these stories as fiction. Cooper always ends up in the Red Room because he is living out a performance through fiction that always ends the same way, with the curtain descending, ending our ability to interact with the world. Why does any of this matter? Well, because with all fiction, the fourth wall is what separates two worlds, and these two worlds interact with one another regardless of whether or not one is fictional. When we sit in a room and watch a movie or a TV show, we're participating in this strange conversation between our world as audience participants in a room and the world constructed by fiction. We're receiving information as silent observers and being influenced in some small way by this. If we look back at Blue Velvet, the movie is initially a dark movie, then ends with a form of bittersweet optimism that is pure fiction, but calls attention to reality. In movies, we can have a happy ending. Dorothy can be saved, and this is a good thing. We need this to happen in movies for a reason. We need to believe that the world makes sense, and that good things happen to people who deserve them. That morality is simple, and that we can have hope for the world. But that's the thing, right? We want to see our own world as good, so we look to fiction to show us hypothetical scenarios in which it is good. But Blue Velvet ends by implying that nothing can undo the trauma that Dorothy underwent, because in real life, surviving abuse at the hands of violent men doesn't result in a happy ending. Real-life misogyny isn't so easy. Blue Velvet exposes the parts of reality we don't want to see by allowing us a safe way to experience it from a distance through fiction. But as a movie, Blue Velvet is one piece among many in a collective societal conversation about gender. So many other movies imply so much worse things about women, implying that women deserve to suffer or be objectified, or that there's no responsibility on part of the viewer or the society around a woman if the woman experiences hardship. Movies boil everything down to an extremely simplified version of morality, so that we can feel like our world is better about these kinds of things than it actually is. But then, if we save Dorothy Valens, the movie ends and we're still in the real world, where things never are that simple and easy. Where people like Dorothy can live every day experiencing even worse things and not having hope that there will be a day where things are better. Where people like Dorothy live with trauma that will haunt them forever, even if they escape it. If we solve Laura's mystery, the TV show ends, and we have to go back to the real world, where so many girls like Laura are brutalized and killed at the hands of horrible men, while others neglect and ignore their needs. The fourth wall provides us a window into a fictional world, but also provides us a lot of comfort by removing us from the reality that underlies fiction. We don't have to care that Laura is dead, because Laura is not real. But Laura is real in the sense that there are so many women like her who have endured the same kinds of things she has. We can distance ourselves from fiction using reality, and we can distance ourselves from reality using fiction. This is what TV and film have capitalized on heavily, and especially so during the 1980s. Escapism sedates viewers by refusing to allow viewers to have to contend with morally complex topics. I've covered this in an article on my Patreon where I apply it to video game violence. Fiction often resolves moral conundrums for us so that we don't have to feel the need to do anything about the world around us having serious issues. I think, on some level, Lynch explored surrealism more heavily in Twin Peaks than in Blue Velvet in order to begin the process of breaking down the comfort that the fourth wall presents us as viewers. It calls attention to our own role as observers and the role of creators and the role of fiction in storytelling in order to start to take away the comfort that the TV screen presents us when it creates the distance needed to both leave our own world and stay external to the world of the fiction. The surrealism of Twin Peaks clues us into the relationship between creator, content, audience, and the world that we are collectively a part of. And it all goes back to Laura and the town that failed her and our collective societal role in perpetuating the culture that allowed these things to happen. The surreal elements of the show also reference contemporary media of the time by suggesting things about television as a medium and the kinds of things that air on TV. Just as the 50s aesthetics are referencing the sudden fondness for 50s traditionalism that occurred in the media in the 1980s, the surreal elements are suggesting something perilous about the way in which television portrays our culture. Bob is not just a stand-in for the evils of men, but also for the evils of men on TV. Laura's objectification is not just a symbol of the misogyny of 80s America, but also 80s American media and TV shows especially. Just as the Red Room shows us a backstage look at Twin Peaks, it also provokes us to ponder the backstage of other TV shows, how their production was handled, what it resulted in, and what these things mean. There's an existentialist element to the surreal elements of the show as well. After all, the surreal elements of Twin Peaks are, I hate to speak outside of my knowledge, but maybe a bit Lovecraftian. I'm not an expert on Lovecraft, I've never read anything of his, and mostly have picked up on his themes through osmosis, but cosmic horror, this grand feeling of insignificance, is the spark of both nihilism and existentialism, and it's definitely present in Twin Peaks. As Cooper is faced with this feeling that the world before him is so much smaller and less significant than he had previously thought, both Cooper and we as viewers are being exposed to the vast unknown that is perpetually around us. This is why I say that the Red Room is a waiting room between life and afterlife, because it reminds us of our mortality to be faced with the potential that there is something beyond what we can possibly know, that behind the front stage of our life there is a backstage that we're not perceiving. Maybe it's non-existence, maybe it's reincarnation, maybe it's heaven. Lynch has explored all these possibilities in his work, basically all the works I intend to cover. The great unknown is poked at with Twin Peaks' surreal elements, especially the Red Room and the presence of Bob and Mike. It faces us with an infinite potential, but consequently makes us feel insignificant, makes our life feel absurd and potentially even meaningless. There is so much more than the limited perception we get, and Twin Peaks exposes the characters and us to this aspect of our reality. The importance of potential realities in Lynch's work relates in part to this existentialist notion, that when faced with the great absurdity of existing our limited mortal lives, we have to find a way to make meaning. The grandiose surrealism of Twin Peaks isn't meant to only provoke us to think about those elements, but the small town and the small world contained inside. It's meant to make the lives of the characters and the lifespan of the show itself that much more meaningful because of the potential for disruption or even non-existence. A lot of Cooper's silly yet iconic quotes relate to this too, as Cooper seems to live life by a philosophy of finding meaning and value in little things, even if they seem inconsequential. The quote about allowing yourself a gift once a day, or about whittling because that's what you do in a town where a yellow light means slow down instead of speed up. In fact, Cooper's whole characterization really captures the themes of learning to live in the moment in the face of existential threats, as he repeatedly allows himself breaks relating to coffee, donuts, and pie, and generally seems to appreciate living in the moment, even if he's focused on a case. And finally, to close out our discussion of the supernatural elements of the show, they also reflect the postmodern condition. You know, the concept that the series is about. See, as life continually became modernized after World War II, we entered the postmodern era, where rapid shifts in the way life was lived on the basic level meant that we became increasingly susceptible to confusion and manipulation. The postmodern era is one in which life has fully given itself to capitalism and other forms of unequal social arrangements. The forces of capitalism are forces we don't always see guiding our lives, but they guide us nonetheless. Media impacts the way we view the world, but media isn't objective. It's often constructed with specific purposes in mind, and this affects us. We're susceptible to power dynamics before we even realize they're occurring. And capitalism has completely encroached upon nature, as discussed in my video on Eraserhead and the early parts of my video on Blue Velvet. Human life has become increasingly less significant to the societal machines that control it, as is somewhat acknowledged by Cooper's admiration for Twin Peaks as a town and the way in which life still seems to matter here. The artifice of a pre-postmodern simplicity is present in Twin Peaks, but is being encroached upon just like in Eraserhead and Blue Velvet. Ben Horn, drug rings, and domestic violence are destroying the natural tranquility that Cooper is suggesting Twin Peaks has. It's the competing narratives of the 50s playing out at the same time, and the dissonant effect it has manifests in the supernatural elements of the show, with demons as manifestations of the great evils of man. Those great evils are not just individual, as in Leland or Wyndham Earle. They're societal as well, as in Ben Horn and One-Eyed Jacks, or Mr. C, or any number of other examples. The dangers of postmodern life and its dehumanization of individuals, its objectification of individuals, capitalism and postmodernity in America present an existential threat to us all. And this existential threat is portrayed both literally through the death of Laura Palmer and the harming and killing of other people in the town of Twin Peaks, and also symbolically through the demons, angels, and other surrealist elements. Twin Peaks was a major moment for Lynch as an artist, as it's when he took surrealism into the mainstream. Episode 29 in particular feels like a course correction for his career, as he had started to embrace surrealism and horror more overtly from that point on, and became increasingly less interested in traditional narrative. Twin Peaks is a traditional TV narrative with very non-traditional approaches to style and meaning. The show uses the death of Laura Palmer as a window into the spiritual, interpersonal, and political problems befalling a small town, and uses that small town to comment on the cultural problems with 1980s America and contemporary TV shows, all while framing it from the lens of deconstructing 50s nostalgia, which had begun to rise during the 80s under Reagan. The show also critiques capitalism and patriarchy through the major villains of the series, Leland Palmer and Ben Horn. It plays with its own meta in order to call attention to the role that the audience plays in the media that we consume, and the role of the medium itself. We're not only watching a story, we're watching the construction of a story, we're watching the construction of a reality, of a political notion. We're being affected by the construction of narratives, not just in the show, but in all shows. Twin Peaks makes us aware of its own fictional nature in order to call attention to the sociological, psychological, creative, and political processes that are otherwise obscured by TV as a method of escapism. Lynch is discouraging escapism by ever so intangibly making us aware of our own placement in the construction of these narratives. We are being made to passively observe, but being asked to maybe not be so passive about it, to pay more attention and to express skepticism of the mediums of the art we consume and of the art itself. Twin Peaks encourages this skepticism by framing otherwise typical story elements in a rather disturbing and intentionally self-aware light. Lynch uses mystery, intrigue, and surrealism to force the viewer to consider our experiences with scenes like the death of Maddie Ferguson, the discovery of Laura's body, the Red Room scene, and Beyond Life and Death. He's trying to use TV to deconstruct TV. Sadly, this would only lead to destruction. In the next video, we'll discuss Lynch's most misunderstood original work, the literal prequel and spiritual sequel to Twin Peaks, and my personal favorite Lynch film, at least currently, Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. Stay tuned.